So I'm going to be explaining the crucifixion of Christ and why that was necessary, and how that plays into our salvation. So I'll be doing that in this essay titled "Does Might Make Right?" So the proverb, "In prosperity our friends know us, in adversity we know our friends," suggests that true character is revealed in times of adversity. Similarly, the narrative of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane reveals the divine character in the face of ultimate adversity. So, this scene in the Garden of Gethsemane gives us a unique aspect as we are able to see kind of what God is really like. That's kind of what I'm suggesting here. Is going this is going to displace a deeper understanding of the divine, because now Jesus, who is divine, is suffering adversity, and in this adversity, we can see how he responds to it and basically the actions that are taken, and this will reveal to us the character of God. So, so in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see that God is faced with such great adversity that Jesus prays that if it is possible, this cup be removed from him. Nevertheless, not as Jesus willed, but the Father's will be done. So we see Jesus really didn't want to go through with this, but he's willing to go through with it. So in this essay, we're going to be exploring a pivotal question from this. If God is omnipotent, why did he not simply decree the crucifixion unnecessary, thereby saving those who trust in him? So basically, this is like, why didn't God just tell the hosts of heaven, say, you know what, even though humanity did these evil things, I'm not going to require there to be a punishment or these evil things to result in evil actions. I'm not going to allow these evil actions to have evil results. I'm going to save them from it. So, and basically no one could challenge God on this because he's the most powerful there is. So if he decided to do that, who could stop him? So that's essentially what we're looking at, is why didn't God take that avenue? Because clearly he didn't want to go through with the crucifixion. So the answer lies in God's commitment to his own moral principles rather than a doctrine of might makes right. So God chose not to exempt humanity from the consequences of sin, not because of a lack of power, but to uphold his moral law. As Ecclesiastes 12:14 states, "For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil." So when God judges things, if someone did good, they'll receive the due consequence. If it's a good action, they receive a good result. If it's an evil action, they receive an evil result. So humanity has sinned, thus we are due an evil result. So this underscores a divine commitment to justice. Every action receives its due consequence. Since all humans have sinned, they deserve just recompense for their actions. Divine forgiveness, though a good outcome, must still adhere to God's moral justice. So if God just decreed, you know what, I'm going to forgive you, there's going to be no evil result for your actions, then he would have been violating this moral principle, which is his moral principle. Hence, Jesus' sinless sacrifice meets this requirement. It assigns the consequences of humanity's sins to a willing, guiltless substitute, preserving the integrity of divine justice. So Jesus receives the evil result that our actions produced. So our actions still produce an evil result, as God requires, but instead of us bearing that result, Jesus bore it in our place. So, had God chosen to forgive without the sacrifice of Jesus, his actions could be construed as arbitrary, resting on the unstable foundation of might makes right. Essentially, this is where if he just declared to the heavens, like, you know what, there's not going to be any sort of sacrifice, humans will not have to suffer an evil result for their evil actions, and if anyone doesn't like it, you know, what are they going to do about it? So that's why if he had taken this road, made this choice, then that would mean that God's morality ultimately would rest on a might makes right principle. So instead, by adhering to his own moral standards, God demonstrates that his true righteousness is built on the solid foundation of love and moral consistency. So God still requires the evil actions to have an evil result, which is borne by Christ, which is his love for humanity, that he suffered those consequences rather than humanity themselves. This divine approach does not merely exercise power, but upholds justice and mercy. Justice in the sense that the evil result happens, mercy in the sense that, he suffers it instead of us, exemplifying a perfect moral foundation that transcends might. In the sacrifice of Jesus, God masterfully reconciles the seeming contradiction between justice and mercy. By accepting the punishment due to us, he satisfies the requirements of justice. By bearing the punishment himself, he extends mercy, thus laying a foundation of righteousness built not only on justice, but profoundly on sacrificial love. So, that is why the crucifixion is necessary. And this is why Jesus being crucified extends salvation to us. So this will lead us into this essay here: government as a pinnacle expression of humanity's rejection of God. I went over that one first because the concepts in it are used somewhat in this one. So government as a pinnacle expression of humanity's rejection of God. Oh, and by the way, I used ChatGPT to help me write these things. I basically gave the concepts to ChatGPT and say, hey, make something that is readable and flows well and stuff. And I don't know, I think it did a pretty good job, but you guys can be the judge. Government represents the pinnacle of humanity's rejection of God. Contrary to common belief, it is not Satan but government that stands as God's principal adversary and the ultimate antagonist in the Bible. This essay argues that the devil's greatest deception is not in convincing people of his non-existence, but in the false belief that government was instituted by God to maintain justice and order. There's lots of depictions of, Jesus maybe confronting Satan, or God confronting Satan, as if there's this huge battle between good and evil, and Satan being God's ultimate antagonist. This is not biblical. I don't think it's supported in Scripture. And what is God's ultimate antagonist is actually government. So what is government? So I want to be clear on what I'm talking about. The term government can broadly refer to any system of governance, but for this discussion, it refers to a centralized authority. An example of this is when Israel requested and received a king, thus establishing a government. Before this, as depicted in Judges 19 to 21, Israel had a less centralized form of governance where every man did what was right in his own eyes. This decentralized system contrasts sharply with the centralized authority of a king who dictates what is right in his eyes. In this context, the term king represents whoever holds political power. So in a democracy, for instance, this could be seen as the majority rule. So I'm saying this doesn't just apply to monarchies. It applies to all forms of government. And some people might look at a less centralized form of government and say, well, that's still a government. And I'm like, fair enough if you want to use it that broadly. I don't think that matches the modern concept of a government. But so I'm making that distinction here. This phrase, every man did what was right in his own eyes, is kind of used repeatedly in, I think, the book of Judges. And this kind of describes a state in which I would say there is no government. The origin of government. The need for government is often justified by pointing to the chaotic events in the book of Judges, where Israel is described as a land where every man did what was right in his own eyes. This period of moral and social chaos led the Israelites to demand a king, as described in 1 Samuel chapter 8. They wanted a centralized authority like the other nations around them. So some key things here is there were already other nations that had kings and had this centralized authority. So this indicates that God did not create this format, but rather humans did. When the Israelites requested a king, God, through the prophet Samuel, warned them that this request was a rejection of him and would lead to their oppression. Despite the warning, God allowed them to have a king and anointed Saul as the first king of Israel. While God did anoint Saul, this act was more of a concession to the people's demands rather than a divine endorsement of the institution of monarchy. So I think that's kind of self-explanatory. God did, in fact, choose the king. So I guess if you want to say he instituted because he did that act, the reason I disagree is that this was done as a concession to the people's demands and was not a divine endorsement. So they did this against his warnings. So God's warnings that appointing a king was a rejection of his rule indicates that the concept of centralized human government originated from human desires and worldly influences, not from divine instruction. The Israelites' reference to the kings of other nations further underscores the idea of centralized authority was a human innovation. This distinction is crucial. While God permits and interacts with human governments, this does not mean he originated the institution. Instead, governments are shown to have human origins arising from humanity's desire for a human leader rather than direct reliance on God's guidance. So how does the Bible portray governments? In the book of Daniel, human empires are portrayed as beasts and as a statue that stands in opposition to God. The statue shows an evolution of government from the head of gold, which is Babylon, to the feet of iron and clay, a future divided kingdom. God destroys the statue with a stone that becomes a mountain representing his kingdom. Therefore, this passage portrays human government as God's principal adversary, which God will ultimately defeat. This is reinforced by the culmination of humanity's evil as the beast portrayed in Revelation. In contrast, the devil is thrown into the abyss by an unnamed angel, thus signifying his unimportance. If God wished to portray the devil as his principal adversary, then he would have replaced the statue in Daniel. However, the Bible is a story about the reconciliation of a father, God, with his children, humanity. The Bible summarizes this story in Daniel with the statue representing human governments standing in opposition to God, and God ultimately destroying this opposition. Finally, in the New Testament, Peter portrays governments as human institutions, supporting my assertion that governments were not divinely instituted. Two foundations. In the previous essay, Does Might Make Right?, we discussed the choice that God made between sacrificing the Son or extending salvation to humanity without a sacrifice. This is important because through his decision, God takes the complex question of good and evil and distills it down to a simple choice between two opposing principles. Either might makes right, or ensuring all actions will result in their due consequence. God chose the latter principle and showed his love by suffering the evil consequence of humanity's action in their place. But who or what is built on the foundation of might makes right? I believe government is built on this foundation because all government actions are ultimately supported by the threat of violence. For example, governments use violence to stop crimes, incarcerate criminals, and defend themselves with military might. However, even functions that appear benign are supported with the threat of force. Functions like the Department of Education are supported by taxes collected under the threat of incarceration, a form of might makes right. Programs like Social Security attempt to solve problems like old age poverty by forcing people to pay into the program under threat of incarceration if they refuse, another form of might makes right. Ultimately, all government solutions rely on some sort of violence to support them, making it an institution built on the foundation of might makes right. And to recap, this is the principle that God rejected in the Garden of Gethsemane, thus showing God's rejection of government. So some potential objections people might have. Many will cite Romans 13:1-7 as evidence that God is, or as evidence that government is good and instituted by God, because Paul says Christians should respect and submit to it. However, this fundamentally misunderstands the meaning of biblical respect and submission. All authority is ultimately from God, and Christians should submit to authorities to avoid hostility and unnecessary conflict, not because the authority is good or instituted by God. For example, in Matthew 17:24 through 27, Jesus submits to paying a tax even when he was not subject to the tax. He did this to avoid offending others, not because the tax was justified or because the taxing authority was good. So just because we submit to something does not mean that God is declaring the thing we're submitting to be good. Furthermore, both Proverbs 24 and Ecclesiastes 8 advise people to respect and submit to the king. However, the kingship was established despite God's warning and statement that doing so is a rejection of him. While many assume that God's granting of authority means that whoever or whatever receives that authority is good, this is clearly false. God gives authority to parents over their children, yet Jesus refers to parents as being evil, Matthew 7. And in Jude 1:9, the archangel Michael shows respect to the authority that God had given Satan, despite Satan being in open opposition to God. So in conclusions, we see the Bible presents the major concepts showing that government was not instituted by God, but is actually God's primary antagonist. God says establishing a king is a rejection of him. While God did choose Israel's first kings, he did so despite his warnings to the people. Furthermore, the people refer to surrounding nations as having a king, showing that this was instituted by humans and not God. God presents human governments as his primary opposition, as the statue in Daniel, which he destroys, and as the beast in Revelation that Christ defeats. The choice God made in the Garden of Gethsemane shows the contrast between government and God. Government actions ultimately rest on the foundation of might makes right, and God's actions rest on the foundations of justice and mercy. So that concludes my explanations of that. I think there's a lot of confusion on government. A lot of people see it as a good institution. However, that is not actually how it's portrayed in the Bible. And I find it kind of interesting that what is portrayed as God's chief and principal adversary in the Bible, many refer to as being instituted by him and as a good institution that God gave us to help maintain justice and order. But that's about all I have. Hopefully you found this interesting, and thanks. Bye.